Now we come to item 10, which of course is the main item of our agenda today, and this is the Mayor's final proposal. In every way of the word, really, this is your final mayoral proposal, Your Worship. So the floor is yours now to present your final budget. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, tēnei te mihi nui kia koutou. You talk about the final budget, and I just remember at the time when David Lange resigned as Prime Minister and he had a joint conference with Geoffrey Palmer and Helen Clark, and Geoffrey had just finished praising him, and Lange then burst out, "I'm sorry, Geoffrey, I've changed my mind, I'm not leaving."
Something you haven't told us, Mayor.
Yeah. However, I don't think you need to worry excessively about that. Firstly, look, can I just acknowledge everybody that's been involved. It's called the Mayoral Proposal, but actually it's a proposal that has input from everybody across council. Our staff have worked huge hours on this. Councillors, what was it, over 55 hours of workshopping and discussing, over 11,500 pieces of feedback. We've had involvement from the IMSB, and I thank Chair Taiperi and Member Renata Blair for that. And we've had the local boards involved, and I think that move towards intimately involving the local boards in the decision, even though it's our decision because it affects the region and it is the budget for the governing body, has been really important. And I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for your initiatives in that regard. What we've been working, all of us, hard at doing is ensuring that our budget for the coming year meets in a fiscally responsible way the challenges that are posed by the impact of COVID and the globally rising inflation and interest rates. But most particularly, this budget is a climate action budget. The key increases in expenditure in this coming budget are focused on the huge threat that climate change poses for us now and in particular for future generations. Quite rightly, you've pointed out that this is not only the last budget for the term, but it is in fact my last budget after 6 years as Mayor of Auckland City. And I want to begin by talking about what the consistent themes have been over that 6-year period when a whole lot of us around the table have worked together to determine what we want to do for Auckland, what our priorities are, what we need to invest in. And the first of those priorities has really been our focus on infrastructure and on the environment. We have invested over the last 6 years a record level in our capital infrastructure so that we can reverse the previous problems created by population growth getting well ahead of the infrastructure we were providing. The result of that underinvestment is obvious to all of us as we endure the congestion in our transport system, and in the last couple of years have watched as our water supply was threatened not only by the growth in population but also by climate change and increasing droughts. Our environment was also under pressure, and we had seen more than a century of wastewater overflows onto our beaches every time it rained. We, from 2015-2016, looked with alarm at the spread of Kauri dieback, and we have also expressed increasing concern about the impact on our bush and on our native birds of the growth in our predator population. So we've sought over these 6 years to reverse those trends. Our investment in Auckland Transport, for example, under the old ATAP was $20 billion. That has increased phenomenally to $31 billion for the current period of time. Last year, in response to the previous year's drought, we invested $250 million into ensuring the resilience of our water supply. And we've had an incredibly dry summer and autumn, but we've got through it, and that shows the immediate results of the investment that we have made. Our water quality targeted rate, our natural environment targeted rate, have both built our capacity to protect and to sustain the environment. I was out at Dairy Flat planting trees Saturday before last. Great group of people out there really making a difference. And I was advised by our folk that are working in this area that by the end of this term, under the Mayor's Million Trees program, we will have in fact have planted 5 million native trees and shrubs. 5 million native trees and shrubs in that 6-year period. We have also significantly added to our public open spaces and to our community facilities. So that's the first theme that has been an enduring theme of these budgets. The second is fiscal prudence. And our first responsibility, I bring it in second, but our first responsibility actually is to manage our finances prudently and sustainably. And we've done that. We've kept our debt at prudent levels, and our general rate increases have been below that of other metropolitan cities. Even in this budget, the 5.9% increase in overall general rates doesn't match long as 13.7% rate increase this year and Wellington's 8.9%. Our council debt, I'm reminded frequently by people, is $10.7 billion. But what does that represent? It represents 17.6% of the value of our asset base. And anybody that says we shouldn't be borrowing, tell me, how do you pay for infrastructure that actually benefits generations of ratepayers? You don't do it out of cash, and you don't do it on the back of 1 year's rate increase or even 3 years rate increase. Of course you borrow, but you borrow sustainably. We thought at the time of COVID hitting us and the emergency budget that we would have to borrow a lot more, given the incredible impact of COVID on our revenue. The credit rating agencies agreed that the threshold limit for our debt to revenue ratio could be lifted to 290%, and our long-term target, of course, was 270%. Well, in this coming fiscal year, our debt level will actually be 255% debt to revenue ratio. So we've not only not used the headroom that we still need in the event of future shocks of 290%, but we are still well below our long-term target of 270%. Our credit rating is one of the highest of any organisations outside government itself, and our credit agencies have rated our outlook as being stable. People also say, are you doing enough to manage wastage? Are you getting the efficiencies you need? And council officers very helpfully pulled out the figures that since 2011-12, we've achieved cumulative savings of $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion, without which our rates would probably be about 14% higher. We took extraordinary measures in the emergency budget to find savings, and last year, Madam Chair, we achieved, as you've noted frequently, a record level of savings through expenditure reductions of 126 million. This year we're on target to achieve 90 million this financial year, ending in just 3 weeks' time. And next year and for following years, we've locked in the same target. There has been a focus on making sure we get savings, and at the same time, we have made the commitment to fully fund depreciation. I know some of the legacy councils fully funded depreciation, most didn't. And if we look at why we are sometimes stretched at meeting renewals, it's because former legacy councils did not fully fund depreciation, and we will do so by 2028, and I believe we need to keep to that target. The third theme, and last theme you'll be pleased to know, of the budgets over 6 years has been an increasing focus on climate action. It's very clear that everybody around this table and online acknowledges the need for climate action. We moved unanimously to declare a climate emergency in 2019. And I think we were also, if not unanimously, very close to that in creating a climate action plan. A lot of work went into that, and I thank councillors for their efforts and the staff for putting that together. There is no one in this room or listening online that doesn't understand that the evidence of global heating is today overwhelming. Last year, New Zealand hit a 110-year record in terms of the temperatures. Wouldn't be surprised if we went above it this year. Sea levels in Auckland are predicted now in the next 10 to 20 years to rise in some places by up to 30 centimetres. And we're seeing all the time evidence that extreme weather events caused by climate change are becoming more and more frequent. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned us just last month that we need to act now if we are to avoid a climate disaster that will have severe impacts on us now and even more so on the lives of our children and grandchildren. So unashamedly, I say in this budget, the focus is on ramping up our actions in response to climate change. Without providing the actual hard resources to reduce carbon emissions, passing a climate emergency declaration and even putting in place a climate action plan are simply declarations of good intention which won't have any real impact unless we put our money where our mouths are, and Aucklanders have told us that they're ready to do that. People expect us to have the courage and to show the leadership in taking action on climate change, and that's what this budget sets out to do. The major new investment in this budget is around laying the foundations for change that will reduce future carbon emissions. And in particular, we're focused on assisting people by giving them the choice of their mode of transport. 43% of carbon emissions in Auckland come from transport, and all of the experts have told us, our own officials and outside of our group, that the most important thing we can do is to reduce carbon emissions from the use of private cars by encouraging mode change. And that's what this budget tries to do. Taking the proposed actions also have real co-benefits. They have co-benefits because the more successful we are in getting people out of cars and onto public transport or active modes of transportation, the less cars on the road and the lower the congestion. And we know too that we reduce pollution when we reduce the use of private cars that are carbon fuelled. The Climate Action Targeted Rate has been built around staff analysis and the many workshops where we've questioned and we've refined collectively the recommendations put to us. Councillors last December voted unanimously to put these recommendations out to public consultation, and the public response was very, very clear. A record number of public submissions were received. I think in total, over 11,500 was the figure used before, and the vast majority of those people commented on the Climate Action Targeted Rate. 2/3, actually more than 2/3, 68% of those who submitted to us supported the Climate Action Targeted Rate. Now, all of us know as elected representatives, if you go down the street and say to somebody, do you want your rates to go up? 98% of the people are going to say no. But if you say to them, are you prepared to pay more in rates in order to address this problem that threatens the well-being, indeed the survival of us, our kids, our grandkids? They came back and they said, absolutely yes. They have given us this mandate. And if we don't believe the submissions, we did a survey, an independent survey that tried to equally draw on all sections of our community demographically, region-wise, ethnicity-wise, age-wise, income-wise. And an overwhelming margin of that survey also said, yes, please, we are prepared to support a climate action targeted rate by a margin of 12%, 48% to 38%. And every geographic area, almost, every ethnicity and age group supported our proposals. The overwhelming majority of our local boards I think 17 fully, 2 partially, so 19 out of 21 supported the rate. It's rare that we have such a strong view held across the board. We have a mandate and we must act on it. I think I said in one of the workshops that the Australian elections were interesting in this regard. 15 members in safe Liberal seats lost their seats, and they lost their seats to what are called the teal independents. And the key platform, not the only platform, but the key platform that they campaigned on was the necessity for climate action. And it's clear that the public want their elected representatives to act on their concerns. Beyond the climate action that we are supporting in this budget, the budget continues to invest in infrastructure at record levels. The planned capital investment this year is $2.85 billion over each of the next 3 years. That's an average, and that average is $650 million more than the average actual delivery in the 4 years from 2017-18 right through to 2021. We are continuing that investment in infrastructure, but at the same time, we are adopting a conservative approach to new spending proposals. And the reason for that is clear to everyone here. Council is still suffering significant losses of revenue as a result of COVID. Normally I'd be building into this budget $60 million in dividend from Auckland International Airport Limited. This coming year, I think, Peter, the figure is 0, building up to 48 million next year. Normally, we would be getting increased growth in fares from increased patronage of public transport. But because of COVID, while our public transport is gradually recovering, we're still only at patronage levels 61% of pre-COVID levels at the same time of the year. On top of the challenge in revenue, we have the anticipated increase in inflation and interest rates, which are projected to create cost pressures on our operating budget of as much as 90 to 150 million a year in coming years. In the immediate financial year ahead of us, 2022-23, we'll be able to cope with these pressures without increasing rates beyond the planned 3.5% set out in the long-term plan, or indeed without the need for any major expenditure cuts. We are not writing a budget for future years, but we need to know what is on the horizon, and we need to set out very clearly the options of how we cope with those pressures. What I am proposing for this year is that we use the full amount of 127 million that the government will pay council in the coming year as part of its Better Off funding in the Three Waters package. There's a further sum payable to Auckland Council on top of the 127 million of 381 million in financial year 24-25, but that is dependent on the reform being implemented, and that sum will only be built into the budget package when it's certain. Using this money does not require us to change our position of opposing the governance model in Three Waters, which I have been forthright from the start in saying is not appropriate, and that there should still be responsibility to the elected representatives of this council. I, in fact, went so far as being the sole member of the Government Working Party to issue a minority report saying, while we support the reform overall, we do not support the governance model. Auckland was excluded from the government's initial payment to councils of 750 million last year. I think we got 2 or 3 million, Peter. Accepting Better Off funding does not change our view on the governance model of Three Waters, but what it does do is allow us to relieve the pressure for further rate rises to deal with inflation, running at almost double the level of the proposed 3.5% general rate increase. There is no benefit in us not using this money. There is only downside, and we have given away nothing to ensure that we can use that money. The funding, together with spare capacity above our targeted increase in fully funding depreciation next year, means that other measures to meet additional costs will not be needed in the coming year, which gives us the gift of time to analyse what the best options are and to provide advice for the incoming council at the end of the year. I want to stress this is an annual budget, not a 10-year budget. Under the Local Government Act, we are required to look at the coming financial year, not at the years beyond that, as is the case with our long-term plan, our 10-year budget. There will be a new council and mayor at the end of this year, in October. They will potentially have different policies and priorities. Constitutionally, no council, or for that matter, no parliament, can seek to determine the policies of its successor, and I'm not trying to do that in this budget. However, it is important that the budget sets out for the next council a menu of options to choose between to respond to anticipated future budget pressures. One option will be to defer some capital expenditure, which may in any case be necessary because of supply chain constraints, shortages of material and skilled labour, and rising costs. In this budget, I'm proposing a deferral of $230 million, of which around $30 million will be in the coming financial year. The future council will have the ability to revisit projects beyond next year if circumstances change and allow that to happen. I'm further proposing a reduction of $30 million in 2023-24 and $50 million in 24-25 in council operations spending. There's a reason for doing that now, and that is that council need to be able to provide the incoming council with options for cuts which it will need to consider before going out to public consultation for the 23-24 budget, which it will do in December. And John, I think you've got your mic on. If you just want to switch that off, please. We set out a framework in this budget for determining which spending has lower priority in our consultation document. This was in fact supported in public submissions. It is important that Council continually assesses the value of its spending in existing areas when it wants to set new priorities in other areas. The default position should not simply be when we need to spend more on new priorities, we should simply add that on top of all of the existing expenditure and then pass that on to the ratepayer by way of rate increases. I want to acknowledge that no expenditure cut is ever easy, but the sum of cuts proposed is small in comparison to the overall OPEX budget of $5 billion this year and the core base OPEX expenditure of $2 billion this year. So it will be the $30 million and the $50 million out of that core base OPEX expenditure of $2 billion. I have not proposed in the consultation documents that Auckland should sell its shares in Auckland International Airport Limited. These have proven valuable assets to Council with strong annual dividends of around $60 million a year in recent years and strong increases in the worth of our shares. The value of our shares from the time that we last had a report proposing we should sell them in 2015 and 3 years later in 2018 went up by $1 billion. If we'd sold them in 2015, that would have been $1 billion in loss to Council. It was agreed earlier in the budget proposal not to proceed with consultation on the sale of Auckland International Airport Limited shares. I do propose that we look carefully at the way Ports of Auckland operates in order to ensure we get a better value from our investment in this asset because of the decline of the competitiveness of Ports of Auckland over time. The dividend has shrunk for us from around 50 million to maybe 4 million in the current year and maybe slightly less than that in the coming year, and that has to be a cause of concern to all of us. We need to examine what our options are in relation to ensuring the greater effectiveness of how ports operate. We should continue to sell non-strategic properties surplus to our needs and to press for value for money efficiencies. A future council will also need to consider whether in a high inflation environment it wishes to keep general rate increases at 3.5% or increase that rate. This should not be determined now, but in light of the circumstances at the time that future budgets are put together. And those circumstances are subject to huge uncertainties. If the Three Waters reform is implemented, as I said, Council will receive a further $381 million from the government's Better Off package. But that reform would also transfer Council's Healthy Waters, our stormwater division, to the new water services entity, with a potential reduction in expenditure by Council of up to $221 million a year. That would result in an ability to reduce rates by around 11%, offset by whatever rates are struck in 2024-25. Another uncertainty is the outcome of the future of local government, the review. My understanding from members of the review group is that they will be recommending significant devolution of funding from central to local government. Now, it's unclear how government will respond to this recommendation, but if it doesn't respond to that recommendation, one wonders why the review was put in place. Auckland Council has long advocated, and me in particular, for the return of GST on rates to Council, which could increase our revenue by around $300 million a year, a hugely significant sum, and Council should continue to press strongly for that. I've pressed 3 finance ministers and 2 prime ministers over it, and this council or the next council needs to continue to do so. On top of these uncertainties, there are questions around how the current Reserve Bank actions will reduce inflation and subsequently interest rates within the next 2 years, whether the supply chain constraints will continue to afflict New Zealand as it does the rest of the world, and whether global inflation, especially oil prices, will continue, and that of course may depend on events in Ukraine. For all of these reasons, the decision on rates can only be taken closer to the time when future budgets are being put together. So, Madam Chair, in conclusion, this budget is a climate action budget, and that is where this budget is going to have its greatest impact. It acts strongly to allow us to take actions that will reduce future emissions so that our city, which makes up more than a third of our country's population and even more of our GDP, can play our part. But equally importantly, this budget commits to a prudent and fiscally responsible approach to financial pressures, and I commend this proposal to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship. And look, I just apologise for a whole lot of people running around. It appears that there was a power cut in Albert Street in the middle of your presentation. I understand that the power is now back on, but I wondered to that end, and I'm not exactly sure when the power cut occurred, whether there is anything you would like to highlight from your speech right now that isn't in your mayoral proposal, which is in the agenda. And I'm just very conscious of the fact that although we have a quorum here, we have a number of councillors back in Albert Street. So is there anything you want to highlight?
I think probably the best proposal I can suggest to my office behind me is to circulate my comments in a written form, and somebody on the 27th floor can drop that down to the 26th floor and they can do so immediately. But I fear to test the patience of councillors around this table by repeating anything that I've just said at some length. So perhaps if we can do that, Madam Chair, and I'm very sorry that has happened to those that might be in Albert Street, and perhaps we can compensate for that by answering any questions that they may have. But the presentation that I've given today is different from, but similar to, the presentation I gave at the workshop just a week ago.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really, really good idea. So that will happen, and thanks to your staff for organising that. To those online, in Albert Street, you will get a copy of that presentation. I think we'd all like it, actually, to be honest.
Yeah, we can email it to everybody, and equally, it might be useful to email it to the news media because, despite what I thought was the clarity of my proposal, I still had a certain journalist suggesting that I was proposing to the new council that we sell our airport shares. And those of you that recall how passionately I argued against that in committee will know that that is very far from the truth.
Right, thank you. So look, I'm going to kick off the questions, Your Worship, if that's all right. And my first question to you is as follows. At a time of high inflation and associated cost of living challenges for homeowners, what evidence can you provide to ensure that the combined rates of 5.6% and higher if you add the water, which is of course the average general rates of the 3.5, the NETA, the water quality, the climate action targeted rate, rubbish, etc. What evidence can you provide that this is actually affordable for Aucklanders?
I think the important thing about affordability is that it's not uniform. Most of those around this table will not have any problem with the affordability of their rates. And in fact, probably most Aucklanders won't, but there will be some people on very low incomes for whom any increase in any cost will have a significant impact on them. Now, we have, through central government, a rates rebate scheme that will assist those people. But when we put together these budgets, we always have a huge ambition to do some good things for the city, and all of those good things cost money. And we constrain that ambition by an understanding that the only funds ultimately that we use come from the people that we serve. I mean, we do have charges and resource consents and etc. So it's always a case of finding that balance. There was an inquiry some years ago that I'm going to ask Andrew Duncan maybe to come to the table to address, that said that rates are reasonable if they are within 5% or less of the income of the rate payer. And Andrew has gone through local board area by local board area and been able to demonstrate that in every case we are significantly below that level of 5% of income. I want to say also that, and I used in my introductory comments, and we always look at what comparable cities are charging in terms of the percentage rate increases. In the first term, I think we kept our rate increases to 2.5%, which was the lowest of any significant metro or growth area. This time, last year, I think we were still lower than almost all. This time, we are significantly lower than Tauranga and Wellington, and we're roughly in the vicinity of the other metro centres that are generally within 5 to 6% of rate increases. The comparison's not exact because I think Christchurch is raising their rates by 5-point-something%, but the regional council is raising their rates by 24%. I think I've got that figure right. So it's not a direct comparison, but we have prided ourselves on our absolute focus on keeping rates as low as we can, but not at the expense of creating for this city the things that it really needs. But may I ask, through you, Madam Chair, for Andrew just to further address that question.
Thank you. Andrew?
Good afternoon. The local government rates inquiry in the 2000s had a careful look at what was rates affordability. They came up with a threshold of 5% of income. And rates, they were looking across the country at all local authorities, so they included water and wastewater charges, because that's what other councils provide. Auckland councils, our rates don't include that. We have done an analysis of the affordability of rates based on the proposals you have in front of you today, and adding in the water and wastewater charges. The average residential property in Auckland, the Some of the proposed rates and water and wastewater charges will be 3.6% of the average household income. For the median value property, the rates and water and wastewater charges will be 3.37% of the median household income. And when we looked at the median property values and the median incomes for homeowners, across all of the local board areas, all of them came in under 5%. And the 3.6% average for Auckland compares well with the other metropolitan centres. So Hamilton, Christchurch and Auckland come out at 3.6%, Wellington a bit lower, Tauranga higher. So comparatively, well within the same as the other metropolitan centres and well within the affordability benchmark across Auckland.
Thank you, Andrew and your worship. My second question is around debt. You know, the debt for 22-23 increases by almost 8% in this budget. That's an eye-wateringly large figure, about 900 million, almost $1 billion. What evidence can you provide to give Aucklanders assurance that this debt increase is indeed prudent and does not make council's total debt out of control? Because I've heard a lot of talk about our debt. It's huge, and I think it's really important to be very clear about the evidence to support the fact that our debt is not out of control and it is actually within prudent levels. So what evidence can you give to supply that, please?
Well, the first statement I'd make is that debt may have gone up 900 million in the last year, but the value of our assets went up by 2.7 billion. And that's why I used the figure, I think it's around 17.5%, 17.6%. The debt represents 17.6% of our total assets. And I think most of us as homeowners, for most of our life, would have had a debt considerably higher than that, because just like council borrows for long-term assets, we all borrow to take a mortgage out in our homes. Secondly, so the debt to asset ratio is clearly at a prudent level. Secondly, the other measure we use is debt to revenue. And I mentioned before that our long-term target was to have a debt to revenue ratio of 270%. But with the loss of $900 million in revenue to COVID, we approached the rating agencies and said, can you just have a look at that and say what a prudent level of a threshold limit for a debt to revenue ratio should be? And they agreed to raise it to 290%. Well, actually, in the financial year for which this budget applies, we will only be at 255% debt to revenue ratio. So well below our long-term target level and even further below what the credit rated agencies said would be acceptable in the short term because of the impact of COVID. So debt to revenue is fine. The fact that we've got the credit rating agency of AA and AA2, I think it is, from Standard & Poor's and Moody's, with a stable outlook, also indicates that the credit rating agencies regard our management of debt as being prudent. And in fact, Standard & Poor's have said that with Three Waters and the transfer of Watercare debt and Healthy Waters, they are actually looking at raising our credit rating to AA+. Now, nothing happens until it happens, but clearly what we've shown in our past prudent management of our debt is reflected in the credit rating agencies and their stable outlook and their high rating.
Thank you for that. Now, I think you've covered this in your presentation, but for those who are online and may have, I'm not quite sure where they came off, I think this is an important one for us all. If we accept the 127 million of better off funding from government, does that in any way give government any impression that we have changed our stance on Three Waters? Because you and I both know we haven't. Yep. Now, it's a bit of a rabbit out of a hat, but can you give us, absolute surety?
I can. Those of you that have participated in Local Government New Zealand discussions with the Prime Minister has been available, and when I've expressed my view on the governance model that would apply to Auckland, know that the government knows only too well what my position and Council's position is. I was the one member of the working party that the government set up to make changes to the Three Waters proposal that produced a minority report. I forget how many pages it was probably about a dozen pages, so I'll forgive you if you haven't read all of them, but you will see set out in excruciating detail the arguments that I've used as to why that model is not the model that we prefer. We do support Three Waters reform. Just crazy having 65 separate 67 I think, separate water authorities, something like the Kaipara District Council with 27,000 people. Well, how do you, with a ratepayer base of that, provide the quality of water infrastructure you need? So we agree that there needs to be amalgamations, there needs to be economies of scale, there needs to be greater efficiency and greater professionalism. But Minister Mahuta herself in her cabinet paper, which I read when it was released under the OIA, said we actually thought of leaving Auckland out of this because they already have many of the features that we're looking for in a reform structure. So we're giving nothing away. Our position is the same as it has been consistently. I have been boringly consistent on this, and I'll continue to be boringly consistent on it when we make submissions to the Select Committee on the bill that's just introduced. But if I said to anyone in this room, anyone online, hopefully still online and without a power cut, should we say, as a matter of principle, you can keep your $508 million that you're offering us, rather than using that money to the benefit of Aucklanders and to relieve the pressures on Aucklanders of the need otherwise for a rate increase or greater expenditure cuts, they'd say, no, go to it, son. You take every dollar that the government is prepared to put on the table that you can use for the benefit of our city. And that's what we're doing. And I don't think anybody, apart from, the one or two fringe elements, won't mention their names, believe other than that.
Thanks, Your Worship. My final question is to you, Peter, as our Chief Financial Officer. And that is, one of the key objectives for me is that even in these tough conditions that we face for next year, that our budget is sound enough to give our rating authorities the confidence needed so that they maintain our current very sound credit ratings. Noting this isn't your decision, in your professional opinion, do you believe that this will be the case?
Thank you, Chair. The Mayor has covered off some of this and some of his comments earlier. So my perspective on it, and not wanting to speak for the rating agencies, of course, is that it's a balanced package with a mix of levers, particularly over time, that includes the move towards fully funding of depreciation, as well as bringing the debt level down to 270 on an ongoing basis. So it comes together as a package currently in an integrated way over that time frame. Appendix B, para 85, I think it's page 389 of Nexus, does give the staff view on some of the credit rating aspects, because it is critical to maintain confidence of the investment community. There are some quotes from the recent credit agency ratings that I'd like to read out. From S&P Global, we expect the Council's financial management, resilient local economy and New Zealand's institutional settings to continue to support the Council's credit profile. And a quote from Moody's, the rating outlook is stable, reflecting the Council's well-established institutional framework, which includes flexibility to adjust revenue and spending and ensures strong governance practices through reporting and planning requirements. Now, that was in October and November last year, and the fundamental framework behind them remains sound, even though the financial position has worsened. So from that quote, we can see that it shows the key factor underpinning our ratings has been our financial management and our commitment to prudence and long-term sustainability. This is backed up by a number of our key barometers and levers: the balance after capital accounts, the net debt to assets, which has just been referred to as being in a prudent space and in that 15 to 20%. So my summary would be that The economic situation has obviously worsened, and the legislative framework means that some levers aren't available for us to use now, but they are in the medium term. What is proposed works as an overall package, and the track record of financial prudence and the integrated and coherent multi-year plan work in favour. So in my view, I think we will, through commitment to the overall package, maintain confidence by walking the talk on that medium term and making sure that the delivery backs it up. So without putting words in their mouth, I'm comfortable with the approach and the integrated package.
Thank you, Peter. The next question comes from Councillor Newman. Councillor Newman?
Oh, yes, look, thank you. Thank you, Desley, and thank you, Phil, for your comments. My question actually relates to the assumptions that are set out in terms of the $230 million of CapEx deferred scenario, which I think is an important consideration in the budget. But there are a number of assumptions in relation to deferred CapEx that I think are wrong. Wrong in terms of our inability to move forward with growth to offset the impact, CapEx to offset the impact of growth, and also CapEx to offset disparities between communities. I have a situation in my ward where the assumptions that underpin the $230 million CapEx deferral include the deferral of spending for an encumbrance fund at Opeki Park. I'm totally opposed to that deferral because it's not our money to defer. Would you consider seconding an amendment if I put it up to exclude that encumbrance fund from being deferred? Because we need to give effect to what that local board has advocated as per that encumbrance fund, which is not money from a 10-year plan budget. It's money paid from a developer for the local board to reallocate in the footprint of that park, and it wishes to do so, but officers have said no, they want to include it as part of the deferral. I'd like to get your clarity on that, because I'd like to be able to support aspects of your budget today. But this particular matter is important to my consideration.
Yeah, thank you for that, Councillor Newman. I am familiar with the encumbrance on Opeki Park and the money that was made available by Sir Noel Robinson. That money is ring-fenced. It can't be used for any purpose other than that for which it was granted. And there is no suggestion at all that this would be regarded as a saving to council. It is simply in terms of timing, and I hope that you've got a response from officers that set out, I think the encumbrance is about 1.8 million, and as a result, instead of being expended in financial year to 2025, that will now be available over financial year 26 to 27. So there'll be a delay, which is what a deferral is, and the same applies to a range of projects right across the city. Now, all of us would prefer that we didn't have to delay any of those projects. Many of those projects will quite possibly be delayed anyway because of supply chain and cost implications. But what you're seeing with that is no loss to the Papakura local board, but in fact simply a delay in when the project will be completed by. So it will slip back 12 to 18 months. And while that's not desirable, if I was to unwind that, I'd probably have an argument to unwind everything that was in the deferred CapEx budget, and then we'd defeat the purpose. So making an exception in one case would not be fair to the other cases, but I can assure you that that money will be available. It is ring-fenced, and the only impact will be is to slightly defer the timing of when that work can be done.
Okay, look, we're in disagreement on that, but my next question, my other question would really be in relation to your level of confidence that Auckland Transport, in the context of facing the massive budget hole that it faces, that confronts it is actually able to give effect to the climate action initiatives that you talked about in workshop the other day. In particular, the electrification of the fleet, as well as accelerated mode shift through cycling investment. I am not clear that Auckland Transport can give effect to those activities for which it appears very heavily reliant on funding from the New Zealand Transport Agency, Waka Kotahi. And I am very concerned about the ability of government to give effect to its funding commitments as a partner to Auckland Transport. I want to understand what your view is in relation to the ability of Auckland Transport to meet those funding commitments, which appear to be very contingent on funding sources for which those funding sources are very constrained.
I think the good news is that when the government released its SURF fund and its emission reduction program, there were defined pockets of money that will be really important for Auckland Transport to be able to do a range of things in regard to public transport, to walking and cycling, and to electrification of the fleet. If we do not pass the climate action targeted rate, then none of the improvements that are signalled in that, and you've got in front of you, the 600 million that's going into buses, which in particular is of a big benefit in your own and Angela Dalton's ward of, will help transform the bus services there, which I know both of the councillors locally have called for over a period of time. Those things won't happen if there's no money. So we can pass all the climate emergency declarations we like, but if we don't provide the money for the agencies to do the work to reduce the emissions and lay the foundation for future reductions, they won't happen. Now, my biggest concern in terms of bus services was that we are currently 270 bus drivers short at the moment. And that is because they have things called split shifts that you'll be familiar with. So you start early in the morning, they give you 4 hours off during the day, which is spent travelling back home and then back to work again. And you've got a starting rate of about $23.50. Under the government package, there's 61 million set aside there so that we can start to pay our bus drivers a decent wage. We improve our recruitment and retention of bus drivers, and we can meet the bottleneck of supply in that area. But I have no doubt that what was announced in the budget this year, and with both major parties in Parliament both committed to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, that further money will be available from central government. And the Minister's office have said directly to me that those organisations that have shown commitment, that are prepared to put money up by way of co-funding and have got plans ready to go, will be given preference to the money that is available from central government. So the big advantage to us is that passing this budget will be showing that commitment, will be eligible for significant sums of money from central government, and we'll be raising that money directly ourselves. Does that solve all of Auckland's transport's problems in the current environment? No. Everybody here, myself and yourself, know that those problems continue to exist. But if you look in hard facts about the increase of investment we've been making in public transport and active transportation and in roads, you'll see that the facts of our past performance speak for themselves. It's never enough, but without this, there'll be $1 billion or slightly under $1 billion less that will be available to improve our transport services to get mode shift. That's the certainty of this budget. If you don't pass it, the $1 billion won't be available and nothing will happen.
And my one final question, Your Worship, would be in relation to from where does government source its funding? The NLTF seems to be completely cooked in terms of the ability to fund from that particular funding envelope. Auckland Transport tell me once again that they have hit a ceiling with New Zealand Transport Agency, Waka Kotahi, around the funding assistance rate for renewals. Government seems to need a new funding source beyond the NLTF because it is fully stretched and oversubscribed. Are you confident that if the NLTF is oversubscribed in terms of central government funding, that central government will fund from a different baseline for those activities which really should be funded through NLTF? Because that is a very important consideration of two things. Firstly, the willingness of government to continue to fund that moving forward, and whether there is a consensus across parties in the Parliament to commit to that, because the NLTF has always been the traditional means of funding in this space. But if that's oversubscribed now, there's a question as to whether we'll be able to continue to rely on those commitments in the future.
Yeah, I do know that the impact of inflation and higher interest rates is going to impact on Waka Kotahi just as much as it's impacting on us. And I do know that from day one, we've always had to fight for every dollar we can get out of the National Land Transport Fund, and we can get for funding for the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. I think, Deputy Mayor, you and I, when we negotiated that first ATAP, I recall going into Simon Bridges' office and saying there's a $5.6 billion hole in the funding of the ATAP program, and actually there was no answer as to how that was going to be bridged. What we have seen is a lot of good faith, particularly from the current minister, who has extended the capacity of Waka Kotahi to borrow to supplement the National Land Transport Fund. But if the question is, can I guarantee that the money will be there? I can't guarantee that because, as you know, that's a decision that central government makes, and we simply advocate for and put pressure to achieve. But I am confident in the good faith of the government to do that, and I hope any future government. And, you know, what we're seeing is money that we wouldn't have thought would be available to us, one through the New Zealand Upgrade Program, and two through the substantial increase in ATAP from $20 billion to $31 billion. Future councils will have the same struggle that we're having now to make sure we try to get everything that we want to put into it. But if future councils make the same progress that we've made in actually increasing the money being spent on the ground and the actual delivery of projects, then I'd be well satisfied. But I can't give the guarantee because it's not within my power to give that. But I can say that on the track record, more and more money has gone into those CAPEX projects. We need more still, but government doesn't have a money tree any more than we do, and there'll always be constraints on it. So that's the most I think I can say to you. I accept the goodwill, particularly from the Minister and his endeavours to fund Auckland in the way that it hasn't been funded in the past and has been overlooked. It's good having somebody with Auckland local board experience and an Auckland member that's in charge of transport, because there's a better understanding of the unique challenges of our city.
Thank you, Your Worship. Next question comes from Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. It's somewhat ironical that I was determined to ensure that I had adequate Wi-Fi today, so I came in to Albert Street, and so I did miss the Mayor's presentation, but somebody from his office has very kindly just come around the 26th floor and given me a copy of his speech notes, and I thank the Mayor for that. But I'm frantically going through it and trying to find if there's any variance between the material that we received before the weekend and that. But the question, there's a couple of questions that I've got. Firstly, just procedurally, how you intend to move forward in taking the votes today, or you can answer that secondly if you like, but at some stage I would like to know just how the votes will be taken and if there are parts that we support or don't support, how we can register those things that we wish to commend and those that we would like to oppose.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Fletcher. And it is ironic, given the problems that you've had with your IT in the past at home, that you come into work and then find there's a power cut. And my apologies if you've missed out on that.
The staff on the 26th floor say we were struck by lightning. So
okay.
Maybe it's the equivalent of winning lotto or something that we've been struck by lightning.
All in all, I think I'd rather win lotto. But yeah, look, if there are any discrepancies, I'm not aware of them. I drafted that speech myself, and I was pretty careful in checking my facts with officers and with my office. On how we take the votes, it'll be the same we've always done in a budget vote. There are a lot of things in the budget that everybody will support. There are some things that you may be less keen on, and you have the choice of, one, if you wish, calling a division on any particular clause of the recommendations, and two, of simply registering your opposition to a particular clause if it's not aligned with your own thinking. So there won't be any change from what we've done. We'll be in Sandra's hands on how those, Sandra's hands and then Sandra, on this, and then the governing body as to how those votes are taken. But they will be taken in line with our normal standing orders, and nobody will be denied the right to vote for or against any particular part of the budget, while still wanting to indicate their support for the budget overall, which is often the case.
So the first formal question that I've got is that despite the many, many hours we have spent behind closed doors to be fully briefed and come to grips with the difficulties in and around council finances as a result of COVID, we've seen you kick the touch in terms of deferrals, discussions around service optimization, and those difficult issues of sort of reducing those low priority spends. Some of those things which I would have thought would have been the direct consequence of the many, many hours that we've actually spent hearing the challenge that council's got facing it. And instead, you've chosen to take the sweetener. And I'm one of those who feels that our negotiating position with central government is impaired with Three Waters. They will realise how desperate our financial situation is, and that's not a good position to be in if there's any sort of negotiations continuing into the future. So I just want to know why you've kicked the touch all the hard decisions.
Yeah, well, one, I haven't, and your colleague who spoke previously indicated that he wished I had kicked for touch on deferrals, but we're not. We're doing $230 million worth of deferrals, with $30 million in the first year. The reason that we have not had to come in with a slammer is because we're not in a desperate financial position. You know, things are tough out there at the moment. They're tough for central government, they're tough for local government, they're tough for governments around the world. But actually, Auckland Council is in a sound financial position. We are not desperate. We have maintained financial prudence over a long period of time and will continue to do so. And that's been my consistent commitment over 6 years. In terms of service reductions, what we did in our consultation document was set out a framework, and that framework was very clearly supported by those that made submissions on it, to say that there are things that we must do, there are things that we should do as a priority, there are less important things. And you'll be aware of some of the changes that we've made, for example, on the contract with the AIMS organisation for park maintenance. We could have kept that in-house with council. We could have put another minimum $15 million in capex into it, and we probably still wouldn't have got results to make it competitive with larger organisations. But we took the tough decision to say we don't need to be here, and we'll move out of that. There are other things that are still subject to confidential that you'll be aware of in terms of home ownership schemes that aren't a priority for us, and we'll make a decision on that, just like we always do. But what we are doing with the funding from the Better Off package is buying us time that we don't need suddenly to slam our ratepayers. And I haven't heard a single councillor tell me yet in any workshop that they think the better alternative would have been to put rates up by 8% this year. I haven't heard a single councillor, but anyone is still welcome in this session today to tell me that that was their preferred thing. Why wouldn't we use that money that's available to us? Why wouldn't we ease the pressure on our ratepayers when they're finding it hard with higher interest rates and higher inflation? And the service reductions, this gives our team the time to work through a range of options that it will be able to put to an incoming council to go out for consultation in December. The reason that I'm asking you to give the officers the power to do that now is so that when a new council is elected in October, on October the 8th, is inaugurated later that month, then it gets straight in, as it always does after an election, to putting out a budget consultation document that we've got, or the council will have, all of the information it needs at its hands to decide what balance the incoming council wants to put on service reductions, capital deferral, or rates increases. But I don't presume to tell an incoming mayor or an incoming council what they should do. That is not my role constitutionally. It would not be appropriate. And the independent chair of our Audit and Risk Committee, Sue Sheldon, massively experienced in this area, has approved our approach as being the most appropriate approach. She said, don't try to tell the new council what to do, but at least give them the menu of options so that they can make a meaningful decision in the circumstances of the time as to what they should take out to consultation. And I'm not following that advice. I said that that's the way we should go, and she said that's the appropriate way to go. And it is certainly not kicking for touch. I don't have a track record of kicking for touch. I do have a track record of being prepared to take the hard decisions when they're made, but I don't impose big rate increases on our ratepayers when we have options not to do that while still remaining fiscally prudent.
Well, I guess that we'll probably continue to have a point of difference on whether or not there were other actions that we could have taken. And by the way, the lights are dimming as I speak in Albert Street. I'm wanting to get clarity, Madam Chair. I'm willing to support the targeted rate on the climate change, but I feel that we've really missed the boat on some opportunities that we had with the general rate. And so I'm just seeking your guidance that an opportunity will be provided when we come to the vote on this, just in case the the power goes out completely again and we lose Wi-Fi. So I'll conclude for the moment because I think I'm about to lose Wi-Fi, and look for your guidance on this a little later in the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
I can only reiterate that there will be the opportunity, if you wish to vote against any particular clause, to do so. And of course, over the 55.5 hours we've spent discussing this in workshops, everybody's had the opportunity to put forward alternative options to be considered, to be analysed, and to be stood alongside what is being proposed today. I don't recall those other options having been put up.
Thank you. Next question we have is from Councillor Mulholland.
Lovely, thank
Good
you.
afternoon, Councillor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, staff, and thank you, Worship. I always find this a very interesting time and quite exciting in some ways to go through what I deem as a substantial document. I have it right here and I have been spending a lot of time on it, as I have in the meetings. I am also very interested, Chair, in how you intended to take the votes, and thanks to your worship for making that clear. And I would have liked to have seen an option on the targeted rates for climate change being put up as a separate option. So I only just share those views because I think it does move into the questions that I've got that also I was very interested to hear how that will take place. So I do support the climate change targeted rate. But Chair, you mentioned in your conversation and speech to us just with regards to the combination of the rates at about 5.6% without water charge, and thank you for the clarity from the team around that. Then, Your Worship, you talked about the 22-23 increases in the $900 million, and you talked about $2.7 billion that we have in increases in assets. So thanks, Your Worship, for your answers with regards to that. However, comes to clarity, and this is my question. Whilst that may be a good position, and for those of us, yes, are fortunate to have worked very hard for some assets, say, whilst the money might look like it is increasing given the improvements that we have seen on the asset value, doesn't always mean that the reserves are ready to hand over, especially in the case of local government. So, Your Worship, I'm just looking for clarity around your comment about Three Waters, and it really is clarity on your comments, because I believe when you accept funding in the case of this by the government, essentially it is saying, if you accept funds, to me that is saying that we agree the principle and we will take the money, and you've given your explanation as to why you think that was, you know, a good idea. But can you just be really clear, because you also stated that it doesn't mean that we agree entirely. So just, I'd like it if you could please clarify, Your Worship. You know, when you accept funds, to me, you accept them and it's saying you agree with the principles, and those principles have been put upon us. I don't support the Three Waters governance model, and I've been very clear in the feedback to you on that. But I do want to just get your clarity around that question. Sorry if it seems a little bit odd, but I don't, you know, if I get money to expend on something, but I haven't agreed with it, but I still spend it, it just doesn't makes sense to me. So you're welcome to clarify again, please.
Okay, I'll give that a go. First of all, there isn't a single person around the council table that doesn't know my views on Three Waters. I've expounded on them very clearly and quite strongly, and I've done the same directly to government in public audiences. I've done the same in terms of my minority report, which I hope you've had a look at, which I think I expressed the views of Auckland and Aucklanders very clearly in. And I will continue to express those views on behalf of the people that I represent and on behalf of this council, for example, in the submissions that we make to the Select Committee on the legislation that was introduced last week. There is no requirement for accepting money from the Better Off package for us to change our views, and I'm not changing our views. My views were I hope, well thought out and clearly enunciated at the beginning, and I haven't wavered from those views, and I won't waver from those views because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. But I think that if you were to ask the average person in New Lynn or Avondale, if the government's going to offer you $500 million without you having to give up your principles and your views, should you say, no, thank you, you keep your money, or should you accept that money and use it on behalf of the people of your communities? I think I know what they'd say to you, because I know that's what they're saying to me around the rest of the city. They're saying, you take whatever funding you can get from government that you can use for the benefit of this city, but don't sell your soul in doing that. And we won't sell our soul, but we will take the money.
So just supplementary to that, Your Worship, thank you for mentioning my communities of Newland and Avondale, because you know I'm incredibly passionate about supporting my communities. But does it not, it still appears to me that what we're saying is it's a done deal by the government and we really have no choice. Is that correct in your view?
Yeah, the government has sovereign power in this country and we're a subordinate, a subsidiary body. Any legislation that they pass in any field is binding on us. As much as we might say we are opposed to this governance model, if they legislate it, it will happen with or without our support, and even in face of our opposition to what is being proposed. So the government has shown by introducing the legislation that they are determined to go ahead with it, and I believe they are, because I've interrogated them, tried to change their minds and not succeeded in that instance. So that's what they intend to do, but why would we then say it's not appropriate for us to accept money that does not require us to change our views, but simply is there as a sweetener, if you like, for the Three Waters package. We can use that money, we can use it on behalf of our people, and why would we say no to it? I haven't yet heard anybody say we should turn down the money and that we should instead put our rates up by the equivalent amount this year. In fact, I've heard almost every councillor that's spoken on that in committee to say the opposite.
Thanks, Your Worship. I am actually trying to labour a point so that the public that do listen to this, and I've had some 500 emails for those that maybe don't understand the process, and I well and truly do, and I am going to make this opportunity to just thank you for your answer, because what it says is essentially it's being imposed upon us, and I wouldn't agree to a further rates increase anyway on the basis of that. So thank you for making it very clear to the public that it is imposed and it may not be something that we all agree with. Kia ora. Thank you, and I reserve my right to comment, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you for that. And I've just got to say, for those 500 emails, quite a few of us have got those, and they are uniform, standard format letters sent out by a particular organisation. Over the last 6 years, I've received those periodically. They've always opposed what I've done. They've made no difference that I can ascertain in the election results that I've got. So, you know, you always take everybody's point into account, but I've dealt with lobby groups over a very long period of time. In the end, we make our own decisions based on the evidence provided to us and in good faith and in line with what we believe our communities expect of us, not what the lobbyists want us to do.
Thanks, Your Worship. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Just one question on that affordability comparison of Auckland, to other councils around the country. I'm curious to know what allowance was made per household for the effect of the regional fuel tax component of being part of the Auckland region. Was there an allowance made for that?
I'd have to ask Andrew on the specifics of that. But what we did, as you'll recall, Councillor, at the time we brought the regional fuel tax in, we also deducted a targeted rate that was put in place to meet the shortfall of transport funding at the time. And additionally, I think that even with the regional fuel tax, our petrol continued to be either cheaper than or not much different from a number of other areas around the country. But like anything, with a regional fuel tax, I go back to Councillor Newman's question, if you don't have the money, you can't do the projects. And we could have gone on, as we've done in the past, and underinvested in transport infrastructure and caused more and more gridlock in our city. But this council had the courage of its convictions and said, we need this money, we have to make that investment. We don't want to put it on rates, because rates mean that the person that travels in peak hours pays as much as the person that travels continuously in peak hours, and ultimately we'll get to a congestion tax which is even more user pays focused, that will be even better. But in terms of the regional fuel tax, clearly that's not a rate, and I'm not sure that it was taken into account in terms of that affordability study. But it's something we decided to do because we all knew that we had to do something to reverse an appalling underinvestment in infrastructure, and we did it.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I mean, the reason I asked it, and I think you'll find that interim transport levy, which was interim, was then replaced by 2 targeted rates. So it actually, this is additional to that. But I guess what I'm really trying to dig down here, and you might not be the person to answer it, but certainly in respect of the Sapir research group that looked into the regional fuel tax, we had a geographical disparity in which a number of areas in Auckland paying above average, and then we also had an income disparity where those in the lowest income brackets, the difference, relative to average across Auckland was quite considerable in terms of 30 to 90% higher. So I guess what I'm just trying to drill down in the interest of fairness, if we're going to compare, the charges as a consequence of living under Auckland Council, for me, the regional fuel tax is quite an important component, and particularly in some parts of Auckland, and then particularly in some income brackets where it's entirely disproportionate. So that's the point I was making, and I guess I perhaps should have asked for that research, but really there's been no analysis of the effects of the regional fuel tax in terms of affordability or impact on family. So I'll leave it at that then. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah. No, look, I take your point, Councillor. I think what you'll find is that probably higher income people will pay more in regional fuel tax, but they'll pay a lower percentage of their overall income. And what we're doing, I mean, this is going to become a significant problem with the congestion charge. We've got to make sure that there are affordable services for our low income people, which is why Community Connect, I think, is such an important initiative in helping our most vulnerable. And we need to make sure that when the congestion charge is introduced in Parliament, that it takes into account the needs of our lower income people, because they're the people, we will all complain about a higher cost of living, but the people that it really hits hardest are always the lowest income. And that's what we've got to deal with by more targeted support to those low income people, and ensuring that there are forms of support to make sure that their transport costs can be kept at an affordable level. So I think we'd probably both agree on that. I think the 2 targeted rates that you mentioned, I'm not sure. I think I recall you voted for both of them, but I hope you did, because they're really good in what they did for water quality and for the enhanced environment. But those were things that people would look back on and say, those are the sort of targeted rates that have enabled us to make a real difference for our city that we would not otherwise have been able to do. And that's the bottom line always. We can hope for whatever we like, but unless we're prepared to fund proposals for a better city, we won't get a better city.
Right, Councillor?
Yes, sure.
That is a yes. Thank you. Next question, Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll put my video on. Hopefully it will stay on. It's just a bit of a weather bomb happening here at the moment, and the internet's a little bit touchy, Madam Chair. So it's probably not directly to His Worship, but it might be these questions might be more at the fingertips of Peter or Ross Tucker, Madam Chair. And it's just some confirmations. Just 3 questions. The first question is around what does a 1% rates increase equate to? I understand it's $20 million, so each 1% equals another $20 million income. Just confirming that is the first question.
Yeah, that's my understanding that it's right, but I'll just ask Peter to confirm that. I see he's just put his mic on. Yes, okay. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. The other one is around the debt. obviously with debt, we pay interest on it, and we're in an environment where interests are moving. And I guess, we hedge that as much as we can. I think about 85% of our debt's hedged. But questions probably might be to you again, Peter, around the unhedged aspect of our debt. So my understanding, again, you might be able to confirm this because I've got some figures here that with our unhedged debt, a 1% adjustment, say in market rates, would equate to about an $18 million increase in interest payments. So the logic of that would say, say if it was 4%, we're looking at interest rate in the unhedged debt, total interest would probably move from about 506 million to about 524 million per annum. Do those sound right to you?
Through you, Chair. Is fairly accurate, Councillor.
Yep. Sorry, Peter.
He said those were accurate, Councillor.
Right, okay, thank you. I might just have to turn off my camera, Madam Chair, just to improve the quality of the line here, and I'll just come back. Final question. So the final one is around GST, and just to understand if we were able to recoup GST back from the government. In other words, we're paying a tax, our rates are a tax, and we pay GST on those. If we could get that back, we pay tax on the fuel tax as well. So have we got a feel for if we were successful in lobbying government for another revenue stream in terms of getting our GST back? Do we know what those figures are? How much are we paying in GST that we could back from, combined with the fuel tax and the council rates, or either or?
It would have a profound difference to us, which is why I've always strongly promoted that to everybody from Bill English through to Jacinda Ardern and the finance ministers that have existed over this last 6 years. $300 million in extra revenue is the best estimate that we've got, and I think the tidiness of this proposal is that it would allow the government to devolve funding to every local council in proportion to the rates that they were taking in and the GST that they were paying. But because we're over a third of the country's population, we'd get very clearly the largest share in that, but worked out fairly on a per capita basis. And I do appreciate your support on this, Councillor, and you'll see in my recommendation after our discussions, I've put that into the recommendations, not because we haven't been doing it, but because I hope that the next council will continue to do it, that they continue to work to support the submissions that we've made in the past to the Productivity Commission and Local Government New Zealand, and just acknowledging that when we put that to Local Government New Zealand, we got 92% support from the sector. So overwhelming support from local government. And what I'm really hoping is that the Future of Local Government review will promote not only the devolution of funding, but use GST as an example. Now, I don't know that they will do that. I know that they will be promoting devolution of funding, but I hope they use the mechanism that we're advocating in these recommendations, because that would be transformational for Auckland and for other local authorities. You can't create a super city and then fund it like a provincial town, and unfortunately, that's what's happened in the 12 years since the legislation passed around the super city.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Those are all my questions. Sorry about the technology.
That's all right. We heard you clearly, so thank you. Next question is from Councillor Coon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. E te koro mātua, Ngā mihi kia koe. Thank you for your Mayoral proposal that you really stepped through very, very clearly and did a fantastic job going through a lot of the issues and the questions that are coming up. So thank you for that. And I did wonder, Madam Chair, if we could bring back Mr. Duncan for a partai, if that would be okay.
I'm sure we can. Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm glad that you were asked before to come forward for a question, because I did feel there was a bit more to round out about the affordability question, and just obviously that's top of mind around the cost of living and how that's impacting households. And I just wondered if there was a bit more to round out. The Mayor mentioned, there's the rates rebate scheme, but there's also deferrals of rates is another part of the package we can offer, if I'm correct. And I just wondered if you can just kind of confirm if affordability is an issue for a household, exactly what it is we can offer as council, and also just can you put that in the context too of where homeowners have experienced an increase in capital value as well, where they may be cash poor, but they're sitting on a lot of capital in their property. Because you have explained this in the past, but I think it would be really useful if you could just confirm the whole package. That would be really useful. Thank you.
If ratepayers are having affordability issues or struggling with their rates, there's a number of ways in which the council can assist them. Our colleagues can make arrangements for rates to be paid weekly or fortnightly. We administer the rates rebate scheme that's run by the government, that's funded by the government, and will assist people working through the process of applying for the rates rebate. And the government will be increasing that, well, usually, I can't say whether they'll exactly do it, but usually they increase the maximum rebate each year, and they'll be doing that, you expect them to do so shortly. I think it was $637 or something last year, and that should be going up again this year. The council also offers rates postponement to ratepayers with sufficient equity in their properties. I note that there have been you'll see from our revaluation that properties have increased by 30% in value since the last revaluation, which was 4 years ago. And while we see commentary in the media about the potential for some house price decreases, the increases up to the last revaluation, if people postponed their rates, they would be able to postpone them for quite a long time before they would eat into their capital value based on those movements. It might have been 20 years perhaps at one point, but that would depend on exactly what the value movement has been. In addition, if people have been struggling with their rates and may have missed some payments, and they enter into an arrangement with our colleagues, put in place payment arrangements and meet those payments, then any penalties will be remitted. Any rates penalties that have accrued will be remitted. So we have a remission policy that you've adopted that provides for that.
That's awesome. I don't think that's very, as well known as it could be in terms of what's on offer. Can I just clarify one point, if I may, Madam Chair? When you said that we can arrange for rates to be paid weekly or fortnightly, is that just more for managing a budget rather than for any discount over the year?
That's correct. We do offer an early payment discount, but that reflects the interest savings that the council will make if payments received early, and only up until recently, because our borrowing costs were relatively low in percentage terms, it wasn't a substantial discount that was offered. My colleagues have also thought about the RFT in relation to the rates affordability, and we hadn't included that in the analysis that I referred to earlier, but in a quick discussion, our view was, yes, it would increase, but only by a very marginal amount, and it wouldn't change the overall position that median rates and water and wastewater and regional fuel tax would still be well within the 5% threshold. But I note that that was a back of the envelope analysis from my colleagues.
Can you just clarify, sorry, Andrew, what did you mean that what wouldn't increase?
Well, the affordability, I think we said, was 3.6 for the average, 3.37 for the median. It would move up a little, but still well within the 5% threshold.
All right, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Andrew. Next question, Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I've got a couple, if you don't mind, Madam Chair. It's come up since I asked to speak, but given there's some questions around the, I don't know, morality maybe of accepting the government's better off funding, I don't know how many people know this, but Watercare and Healthy Waters have been required to do considerable amounts of unpaid work for the Department of Internal Affairs on the Healthy Waters reforms and the setting up of the Northern entity. Would that be a part justification to actually be reimbursed? Because I know that Watercare and Healthy Waters have applied to DIA to actually pay for that, and they've received no response. So is that one of the reasons why it's a good idea to accept that money? Because we've actually had to use our staff to help them. Well, they've required it of us. We haven't really had a choice.
Yeah, the hourly rate would be really good for $508 million for the work they've done, Councillor.
I'm just talking about this year.
Yeah, look, it is true that the DIA has sought assistance from our professional officers, both at Watercare and at Council. And of course, we need to offer that assistance, because if the government is determined to go ahead with this, we want it to work for the sake of all of our people that receive the services. So I know that some of our officers have worked really hard to provide objective advice to government. Central government doesn't always, as you're well aware, understand things that are happening at the local level, and quite possibly Watercare and our council officials have helped them avoid pitfalls that would have otherwise been damaging and have produced a better result. But I don't think it's about morality and not accepting the money. The fact is, the government will do what it will do by way of legislation, and our non-acceptance of the money won't make the slightest bit of difference to that, other than to deprive Aucklanders of a share of money that was dished out to all councils last year, of which we got a minimal amount, and we're playing catch up here. So we're getting the same sort of assistance as every other council, whether those councils support the three waters or don't support them. And be interesting question.
I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was just.
No. You're making the point.
It had been questioned.
Yeah. But no, certainly our officers are doing that, and frankly, if the new provisions do go into effect and are to be made to work, the government should actually listen very carefully to what the one organisation that already exists, which is Watercare, at scale, can tell them to avoid potential disasters and to ensure that New Zealanders get the best deal from the changes that are being made. So, I mean, Watercare could say, oh no, like with it, but that would not be responsible. In the end, all of us have the interests of our ratepayers and our residents at heart, and if the government's determined to make the changes, then we want those changes to be put in a way that will best serve the interests of the consumers.
Thank you. And my second question, Madam Chair, it's around the consultation that went out around increasing local board decision making over local community service, and it's not it's not evident in those recommendations. So I just wanted to be clear if we're going ahead with that or not, and what is the cost of the new staff required, and how are we going to manage that when we're looking for savings? Is there a phasing in of this? How is it actually going to happen, if it's going to happen? And
yeah, the cost of implementing the governance framework review is estimated to be between 2 and 2.8 million a year, and that will be to increase our full-time equivalent employees by 16 to 22 in order to ensure that local boards to whom the new powers are being delegated have advice to make the right decisions in dealing with billions of dollars worth of assets. Now, I know amongst all of us on the governing body, there are a variety of views. Some of us see both sides of it. We see some benefits, we see some disadvantages. But the fact is that when officers put it to us, I think at governing body last year, we voted for it. The default position is that it will happen unless we amend this budget to say that it should not happen. And what I take from listening to councillors and listening to some degree to local boards as well is that there is still a majority support for going ahead with that devolution for the other benefits that it might provide, notwithstanding that it adds to the budgetary pressure of that $2.2 to $2.8 million a year. If it were to be deferred, it would have to be deferred for a full cycle of 3 years. And I didn't get the sense that councillors by majority would be prepared to defer that payment, but people could move an amendment on it if they felt inclined.
thank you. So I guess I would just ask you, or our CEO, in the implementation of that then, to really look at why we need to have a whole bunch of separate staff. Why can't we have one group of people providing that advice to us all instead of duplication? Because I just wonder, I mean, probably there isn't an answer at the moment, but I just ask that we start to look at that. We're too separated. We have advisors here, advisors there. It just doesn't make sense, and I think we could make significant savings, but I'll leave that to the people that do that.
Thank you, Councillor. Next question is from the Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions. Firstly, going back to the local board element here, so this might be a question for Peter. Was there a reason why it needed to be delayed for 3 years as opposed to 1 year?
Sorry, Councillor, could you repeat the question? I was busy writing down the note.
No problem. So if the committee were of a mind to try and delay for cost reasons the local board decision-making element, why would it need to be delayed for 3 years as opposed to 1 year?
Thank you. I'm not particularly close to that issue, other than that it needed to work in with long-term plan types of timings and the ability to come up with the plans that then fitted in. So that was my understanding of it.
Okay, thanks. So back to our mayor. I can't remember us delivering everything we've said we would in terms of capital in any year of this council. So to what extent are we expecting capital deferrals anyway, given such challenges as shortages of key raw materials, labour supply issues, those kind of things? Isn't it sensible to be upfront with the public and say, look, capital expenditure will be deferred, we should build that into our budget?
Yeah, I think you're right. Because of the circumstances, particularly with supply chain constraints, and I'm seeing reports continuously that projects are being slowed and delayed, not just in our council, but right across the country, probably right across the world, actually. We are not going to achieve the sort of 90% delivery on capital projects that we've aspired to in the past and achieved in the past. And there is a degree of inevitability that many of these projects will be deferred. And we know that the one, while we wouldn't want them to be deferred, the one benefit is that when you defer a program for a year, you put off some of the operational costs of maintenance, of operating those facilities, etc. So we are making a virtue out of a necessity. I've kept my proposed deferrals to the lowest level of the options that council officers put up, in fact slightly below the lowest level, it's about 230. It doesn't save a huge amount of money, probably about 15 million a year, which is still 15 million. It doesn't lose the project, and it probably just accepts the inevitability that other constraints would have slowed the delivery of that project anyway. But we can build that into the budget because it is a deferral. Some of the projects might have been able to go ahead. Many, including ones that we aren't formally deferring, will be delayed. And when the projects do go ahead, we have to deal with the challenge that the construction cost index has gone up much faster than the overall consumer price index, and the projects will be spending more to achieve the same thing. And that's not something that we have any control over, or indeed I believe that the government has any particular control over. Unfortunately, it's the impact of international circumstances, and the recent closure of Shanghai has, I know, hit the supply chain side of it really hard. So you are right, yes, some of these projects would be deferred anyway because of those myriad factors that are indirectly related to COVID.
Thank you. And last question, Mayor. So we're currently paying half price fares. I can tell you that within my ward, I've never seen buses fuller in my whole life. It's really fantastic to see. Do you have concerns around the costs of public transport for suburban communities, and how have you advocated to the government to continue helping out on fares to achieve our shared climate goals?
Well, we, of course, very much welcomed the government proposal, much less expensive than the suspension of the part of the excise duty to fund half of the cost of public transport, and we welcome the extension of that through to September, I think it is. Look, in an ideal world, we'd like that to be permanent. We don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where we're challenged for funding. So if we were to pay for the 50% subsidy ourselves, I've seen the figures somewhere, I think it's probably in the vicinity of 150, 200 million. I think targeting that support and then progressively implementing a stronger fare subsidy would be a good way to go. We are getting locked in, not only in Auckland now, right across the country, and the government is paying for 100% rather than the 50% that we were previously required to pay for that. The people that are largely on that beneficiaries, trying to think of the word of the card, community services card. I would like to see, and congestion charge would provide the next opportunity for this. I'd like to see that extended beyond those on the community services card to low-income workers, because I know, and our councillors from South Auckland here will know, that there are a lot of people that are travelling from the south into the city to do work, and as the tourist industry comes back, that will increase, that will find this quite hard. And I think that the incoming council should continue to push for step-by-step expansion of that subsidy. I listened to the group that presented to us last week and the priority groups that they had, and I understand their concerns, but probably I'd put more emphasis than they did on the people that are working, meeting all the costs of going to work each day, but being paid low wages. And certainly they've been helped by, increase in the minimum wage and the expansion of the living wage. But I think those are the people that will find that the congestion charge will disproportionately impact on their disposable income, and we should be advocating to the government to include them alongside the community service card holders.
Quite right. Thank you, Mayor.
I think Councillor Collins has similar views on these things.
Right, thank you. Councillor Walker, question now from you, please.
Sure. You can hear me okay?
We can hear you fine, Wayne.
Yep, fantastic. I've got a procedural question first, and that goes to the recommendation. As it stands now, we're required to vote for the general rate of 3.5%, together with the climate action targeted rate in the one motion. Now, I know, Mr. Mayor, that you've been very careful to actually separate out the climate action targeted rate. And quite obviously, as you identify, it is a separate package and it's targeted. Is it not possible to vote for it separately, as we have done previously for the water quality targeted rate, the environment targeted rate, the accommodation provider targeted rate, and the regional fuel tax, for example, so that we have a continuity of our previous procedures, noting that, as you point out, it is separate in a separate package. So this is a procedural question that amounts to a relatively simple proposal to simply split that motion.
Well, I think the problem is that when you're formulating a budget, you can't take bits out of the budget that will reduce your revenue or increase your spending without distorting the impact of the budget as a whole. And that's why I think you probably it needs to be voted for as a package of measures. So if you were to vote for an increased the climate action targeted rate, but you wanted to reduce the increase in the average general rate, well, you'd have to go, I mean, nobody's proposed that in any of our workshops, so it would come as a bit of a surprise to me. And since it's in our long-term plan, you might be, of course, wanting to increase the average general rate. But I think that you would actually make such distortions to the budget that the budget package as a whole wouldn't work. But I'd be interested in our Chief Financial Officer's view on that.
Yes, could I have an answer to that? Because my understanding that a targeted rate is a separate item.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. With a late question like this, I'm just going to pause for a second and ask for some legal advice on it. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a 2-minute break. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair.